Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a nice day. What's another genre I can review that I've never done on this channel before? How about science fiction? For some reason lately I've just had an itch to read some more work by the influential sci-fi author Michael Crichton. Even if you don't recognize him by name, you'll probably know him by his most famous work titled Jurassic Park. I recently learned that he also dreamt up the TV series ER, which I've never watched, but which I know ran for quite a few seasons before it ended. It turns out, though, that Crichton wrote quite a few sci-fi novels in his life, exploring a lot of ideas beyond simply bringing back the dinosaurs. I learned about Crichton maybe around the time I started high school, before I even realized he was the one who wrote Jurassic Park. I was visiting my grandparents in Ohio for the weekend, as we often did, and before my family left for the weekend, my grandpa handed me Crichton's book, Timeline, and said, "I found this one pretty interesting, let me know what you think." Now, I was close with my grandpa, but he didn't often just hand me a full book to read. More often, he'd just hand me an interesting snippet he'd cut out from the Wall Street Journal or something like that. So I didn't think much of it other than, I'm going to read this book. And I did, which in itself was no small achievement at the time, because while I did a lot of reading of assigned texts for school, it was rare in those days that I made the time to read something just for fun anymore. So I read Timeline, and I quite enjoyed it. I'm not sure to what extent I enjoyed it simply because my grandpa had recommended it and given me this book, complete with copious red underlining at parts he found interesting, and there were a lot of those parts, versus how much I enjoyed it because of the central plot, which I vaguely recall was based on time travel to the medieval era. I at least enjoyed it enough, though, or was polite enough, that upon returning that one, I accepted another two Crichton books from my grandpa. One of them, Sphere, which is about a mysterious giant sphere that is detected in the ocean, presumably from an extraterrestrial origin, and another one, Airframe, which is about the investigation of an airline tragedy in which a plane goes down, I want to say over the Pacific Ocean, but I'm stretching my memory. But the causes are totally unknown, so the protagonists are trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. I enjoyed both of those books a lot, especially Airframe, but then I read nothing else from Crichton for about 10 years, it seems. Last year, though, while in quarantine, I was doing frequent online movie watching with my coworkers. I work in a biology research lab, and someone suggested the 1971 classic, The Andromeda Strain. I enjoyed it for what it was, and it sort of brought back this desire in me to read some more Crichton. So 1 year later, I finally picked up, downloaded on audiobook, The Andromeda Strain to see how it reads as a book. And I enjoyed it a lot. I have a lot more thoughts on the experience of reading Crichton 10 years ago and now again, but I'm going to come back to that in a bit because I want to get to the specifics of The Andromeda Strain now. I won't be giving any spoilers, by the way, just talking about the general premises and feel of this book and Crichton's work in general. The Andromeda Strain begins with an incident in a desert town in the southwestern United States. A government employees tracking down a satellite that has crashed in a low-population town arrive on site to find that everyone there is dead, and then they quickly succumb to whatever mysterious plague has afflicted the town. The rest of this book focuses primarily on a team of 4 researchers who are working to figure out just what was on this satellite that seems to have ravaged the town, and even more interestingly, why 2 people in the town of, I think, 48, a baby and an elderly, sickly man, have actually survived whatever it was that went wrong. So along with figuring out the biology, if you want to call it that, of whatever this pathogen is that they've codenamed, you guessed it, the Andromeda strain, there's a lot of medical investigation too, trying to figure out the precise pathology of this organism and what has rendered a few of these would-be victims at least temporarily immune. From listening to this description, you might now be hearing the words strain, pathogen, infection, and think, it's too soon, I don't want to think about any more pandemics. But although the team in this book is focused on preventing an escape of the pathogen and the potential for a pandemic, the events of the book are much more focused on the pure biology, not an active infectious pathogen that's circulating around the world. I mean, the pathogen is active, but it's not on the loose yet, we think. Basically, the Andromeda strain is far different from the SARS-CoV-2 strain and of interest for very different reasons. I'm not really a seasoned reader of science fiction, although I do enjoy it from time to time, but if we were to place science fiction works on a spectrum from totally grounded in science and reality to quite speculative and loosely scientific, the Andromeda strain would fall much closer to the heavily scientific end of the spectrum, more so even than some of his other books that I've read, like Timeline and maybe Sphere. This is immediately apparent from Crichton's writing style, which frequently references real historical scientists and their work, and then builds and extends upon this body of scientific knowledge to create more recent fictional scientists and publications, all leading up to the investigation of the crisis at the center of this book. Some reviewers or fans of the genre placed this book within the subgenre of techno-thrillers, which really focus on detailed descriptions of technical and scientific processes, and Michael Crichton with this book was one of the early pioneers of the genre. This also means that a lot of the enjoyment of reading this book is an appreciation of the very science itself rather than simply the action and the scenarios it leads to. In the reviews I saw on Goodreads, some readers found this aspect frustrating in that this book is not really a thriller per se. The element of suspense is really scientific in nature, a speculation of what has killed all these people and what it could mean for the future of humanity. And the plot is therefore primarily driven by scientific breakthroughs in the investigation, rather than more shocking plot events like, I don't know, a dinosaur breaking loose and venturing off to search for breakfast. Now, I personally liked this aspect of the Andromeda strain, with, of course, the obvious caveat that I am a scientist myself, so it kind of makes sense. But this is definitely the kind of book that is slow-paced in terms of action, so you have to approach it ready to think through a scientific puzzle with the protagonists. Now, about those protagonists for a minute, this isn't exactly Crichton's best moment in terms of character diversity and inclusivity. Yeah, this novel was written in 1969, so the demographic composition of scientists at the time was somewhat very homogenous, and I'm pretty sure Crichton got at least a little bit better about this in his later works, although I'm not sure to what extent. But my point is, we're seeing here a main team of 4 male scientists or medical professionals, supported by all male teams on the site of the original meteorite arrival. There's not a single female character in the book who contributes intellectually to the team at all. And in fact, at one point early on in the book, I was very briefly baited into thinking that the microbiologist was going to be a woman, only to quickly learn that she's actually answering the door for her husband, a Nobel Prize winning microbiologist who is entertaining some house guests. Ouch. Now, I realize this doesn't exactly undermine the effectiveness of the whole story or anything, but especially in light of recent conversations around the value of seeing relatable role models in STEM fields, combined with the fact that, as I'll get to in a bit, reading Crichton was probably at least slightly influential in my own pursuit of a scientific career, it's a little disappointing to think that curious young women back in 1969 wouldn't have found a single character quite like themselves in that regard. And I can only imagine that with the completely male cast of characters at its time that it was published, this book probably would have been marketed almost as a book exclusively for a male audience. But we can at least give a gold star to whomever it was that insisted on having at least one female scientist for the movie adaptation 2 years later, an idea that apparently faced some resistance, but in the end was widely accepted by the scientific community as well. And she ended up being probably the most memorable character in the movie because they did give her a real role. Like, she was a real scientist with critical expertise for the team, not just someone there to nod her head and smile whenever Dr. Nobel Prize suggests something mildly smart. Aside from that, though, the characters are also just not really even that interesting or different as characters. They know different stuff, but we don't really see much difference in personality. Maybe that's somewhat justified because they're dealing in expertise and solid facts here, but given this is a high-stress situation, you would think that we'd see more of their personalities and weaknesses coming out, maybe some more clashes. One really interesting aspect of reading this book was pondering the question, what is it about Crichton's style that really appealed to my grandpa so much that he gave me some of his books to read? And another question that I soon found to be inextricably linked is, how has my own experience of reading Crichton's work changed since I first read his work as a high schooler with a vague interest in math and science, but no practical idea of what a STEM career is like, to where I am today, where I just last month finished a 6-year-long PhD working as a biological scientist, and I can relate to some of these characters with more of an inside perspective as opposed to the outside, more aspirational perspective I had as a, let's say, a 15-year-old looking at a career in science only as an exciting possibility. I can only speculate as to why my grandfather gave me these books to read since he's no longer alive, but I at least have a few ideas. I suspect that he found its portrayal of the scientific process, even if speculative, to be authentic, capturing some of the essence of what it was that he enjoyed about being a scientist himself. After all, it does the same for me today. But this was especially important because while today I can look at these characters and the experiments they're running and say, wow, this is actually pretty spot on in how it portrays this process, as a high schooler, I'd never done anything like this and could really only speculate about what a career in science or STEM fields actually entailed. So books like Sphere, Airframe, and maybe Timeline, although that one's really a bit out there. They were a bit of a taste of what I might do as a job someday, keeping in mind, of course, that there was plenty of creative, fictional embellishment regarding the actual conclusions drawn. And I have to say, this book and Crichton's other work is exactly the kind of thing I'd suggest for a high schooler in a position like I was in at the time, who's interested in thinking about STEM careers but doesn't really have any idea yet what that might be like. I even think it'd be an excellent foundation for a lesson plan or a series of activities for an ambitious middle school or high school science teacher, or maybe such a resource or lesson plan already exists out there. Some other things worth mentioning that were interesting but that I won't describe in much more detail today. The beginning of the book has a brief reflection on the definition of a crisis, what kinds of crises might occur, and how the world collectively copes with them. Very insightful, especially in the wake of the coronavirus outbreak that we're still dealing with as I record. There's also a clear influence in this book of a Cold War mentality. Nukes are discussed multiple times as a potential solution for containment of the infectious agent, and the US scientific research apparatus is described as driving 80% of the world's scientific discoveries, a figure that might be a bit of an exaggeration or a bit subjective, but also might not be so inaccurate for the time given the sheer amount of resources that the US was dumping into research on computing, biological warfare and security, nuclear physics, astrophysics, and more, much of that driven by the energy/paranoia of the Cold War era. In fact, the whole research apparatus in this book is clearly propelled by US military resources, contributing to a lot of spectacular descriptions, such as an initial midnight recon flyby, or something like that drops a so-called bomb, releasing a brilliant phosphorescent flare to photograph and determine what happened in this decimated town. And US-Soviet relations come up quite a few times in the book too. The discussion of nuking the ravished city, after evacuating the 2 remaining survivors, of course, isn't complete without an exploration of how they're going to explain this to the Soviets. But although these aspects are certainly attention-grabbing, Crichton's overall tone isn't entirely militaristic. And by the end, we get some interesting cautionary reflections, too, about the threats of crises on geopolitical stability. All in all, this was a fun book to read and rekindled my interest in reading more of Crichton's work and more science fiction in general. Unfortunately, one final criticism I have is that for all the buildup and meticulous investigation, the end will feel anticlimactic, convenient, and unsatisfying. At least it was for me. Not enough to ruin the rest of the journey by any means, but much like reading a brilliant whodunit mystery where the final reveal then simply makes no sense, we don't get the final payout that would have really packed one last punch and made this story truly unforgettable as a scientific techno-thriller mystery, whatever you want to call it. Still, it was well worth reading, and if you're interested in checking out Crichton, where better to start than his first big hit? Let me know if you've read this or anything else by Crichton and what you thought of it, or even if you've watched any of the movies based on his books. That's all I've got for today, though, so until next time, bye, and happy reading.